Hi there, I'm Bob Ethington.
And I'm Nick Nicholas.
And this is From Akron and Beyond. And on this episode, we are going to be taking a deep dive into Clone Records, which was an early indie record label that started here in Akron and run out of Akron, and which has quite an interesting history and really was the first place that a lot of very notable music was recorded. And one of the other notable things about Clone Records is that my co-host, Nick Nicholas, was the founder of this label. And so, although this is going to be a little tiny bit self-indulgent on our part, maybe, because we'll be talking about ourselves a bit, a band I was in had records on Clone Records as well. I think the story's worth really going into some detail about, because it was a real uphill battle, and it was real innovative. And I just think it's part of Akron history, Akron music history, that should really be remembered. And so on that note, Nick, I'd like to ask you how you first had the idea to start your own record label.
Well, it started out as a way to get the Bizarros, who were doing original music, you know.
And that was your band?
Yeah. To try to get them heard and recognized and get a record deal. And simultaneously, you know, having that thought, I noticed that there were some records being made independently, like bands that I really loved, Perubu, Television. I remember reading in a magazine, national magazine, about this band from New York called Television, and the review was just raving about them. And they just so happened to have released a 45 you could order for like $3 on Orc Records. So I sent for it and got it in the mail, just like, you know, waiting for the whatever you'd wait for as a kid to come in the mail, you know. And it just knocked me out. It was great.
Now, let me interject here. So, if a band like Television put out their own record, do you think this was just a sort of out of a DIY ethic, or do you think that they were having trouble getting signed by a major label? A band like Perubu, I think, definitely would have been having trouble getting signed because they were so very innovative and avant-garde. But Television is a little more straightforward rock and roll.
Yeah, but reading some of the interviews with various members of Television, they were rejected a lot.
Okay.
So I think it was a little both, you know.
Yeah.
But plus, you know, they wanted to get their name out there. They had such a great reception in New York, you know, CBGB's in that area, that when a friend of theirs, Terry Ork, offered, hey, let's do this now, you know. Mm-hmm. You guys are really smoking. Let's get this out. You know, jumped at the chance.
And of course, a band like Television sounds less radical today than maybe they did at the time. You know, just between the late Tom Verlaine's voice and some of the way they approached their guitar playing and stuff.
Oh, absolutely. But you know, I didn't go into this thinking I was going to own a label and release anything but the first Bizarros 45. In fact, I didn't even think of Clone at the time. The Bizarros EP came out on Guerrilla Records, just because I wanted to think of a name, you know, thought of one at the last minute there. But
what was that first single? Do you remember?
Well, Lady Dubonnet was the song that,
right.
And to this day, you know, it's probably one of our most remembered songs. About a year and a half ago, it came out. It was in the closing credits of the Jeffrey Dahmer movie.
Oh, My Friend Dahmer,
Yeah,
the
My
one
Friend
based
Dahmer.
on the Durf
Yeah,
book. Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
So it's there. So anyway, what happened was distributing other people's records and the different fanzines that I would distribute, like whether it was Bomp, New York Rocker, Trouser Press, Slash, Search and Destroy, Backdoor Man.
These were all indie rock magazines.
Yeah,
and stuff.
fanzines,
Yeah.
indie rock magazines.
And you say that you were distributing them, but so what was that about? Like, was this something that you just did out of love for the music and out of trying to make a buck, or what was the thinking?
Mainly, it was like I said in another episode of this, I was a cheerleader for Akron. There's a lot of talent here, and when I was taking records around, I thought, hey, you know what? Let's get people from Akron and Cleveland would really love to hear about what's going on the West Coast and Europe and Minneapolis and just other parts of the country. Everybody's got they're creative. They're tired of listening to the same old stuff that the record companies and radio stations are shoving down our throats. This is fresh, new music. And,
What year would this be roughly?
75, 76.
Okay, now see, that's interesting because I think when I look back on my musical evolution of my taste or whatever, that sounds awfully grandiose. I apologize. But, yeah, like in the 60s, I loved rock music. And then when it got into like the early 70s, and I'm thinking 72, 3, 4, that era, a lot of it just started to sound really bland to me. It seemed really boring. And at that time, I still had a few rock bands that I loved, obviously, but I started, getting really into jazz, like John Coltrane and Miles Davis and stuff like that. I was looking for more radical outside music, and it just wasn't coming from rock and roll anymore. But then around that period of 75, 76, that's the early stirrings of what would be kind of a rebirth, don't you think, in rock and roll with the punk bands and the new wave bands? And
yeah, and a few years prior to that, we talked about it in a previous show about the FM radio stations that let us, discover great stuff that you would. How the heck would you, hear Sun Ra or Captain Beefheart?
Yeah,
it wasn't even longer versions of what would become Pink Floyd classics later on. So anyway, we had that back then, and when I was sort of thinking about doing something, putting a band together, I heard about this interesting record store in Cleveland called Hiddeo's Discodrome, and I went there a few times and got to know two of the clerks, and it turned out that the guys that I got to know, David Thomas and Peter Lochner, went on to they were Perubu. They were the founding members of Perubu. And the more I got there, the more of
and Rocket from the Tombs as well.
Yeah. That had just ended, and then we're in Perubu. And they befriended me. We became friends. And when I was inquiring about doing something with the Bizarros on vinyl, they told me about a company in Nashville called Nashville Record Productions. That's where later I found out that the pressing plant that they used was owned by Motown, because I went there to pick up some records one time, and they had all these, Smokey Robinson, like thousands, and it was just a heck of an experience. I think it still exists. I don't know who owns it, but I think it's still there. Anyway, that began Clone Records. The Bizarro's EP, Lady Dubonnet on Gorilla was pressed there, as well as, I'd say, out of the 16 Clone releases, I bet you 13 or 14 of them were Nashville Record Productions.
Interesting.
Yeah, a couple of them wound up going to New York later on. When I artwork and the actual cover, like the Unit 5 and the Bowling Balls Volume 2 were done in New York. But also, there was a really cool company called Queen City in Cincinnati, where I had the From Akron album and the first Tin Huey EP done. So, I used 3 different places, but Nashville was the majority.
So this is From Akron and Beyond, and I am Bob Ethington along with Nick Nicholas, and we are talking on this episode about the origins and history of Clone Records, a Akron-based independent record company that Nick Nicholas founded and ran. And so we're at the point now where you've talked about that first Bizarro single, which came out on the Gorilla label. So where did Clone come from, the actual name? And what was the first Clone release, if you can remember?
I always wanted to have a venture named Clone. I don't know why, And I had a friend of mine, he was an artist by the name of Bill Salem, that I sort of I hired him to come up with some clever logo. That was a clever design I could use as a logo for Clone. And he was experimenting art using ink blots. And randomly, one of his ink blots, when he, parted them, and they were more than just a blot, they turned into, I said, man, that's great. So it wasn't really an accident, but in a way it was. I said, that's it.
Right.
So I saved that, and
that's interesting. I never heard that before. So that was the logo. Yeah. How old were you when you were doing this first?
26.
Okay. So the first actual Clone release,
the From Akron album with the Bizarros and the Rubber City Rebels, which was really important because once again my friends in Peru gave me a list of people I should send that to. Mm-hmm. Everybody from rock writers like Robert Christgau, magazines like New York Rocker and Bomb, college radio stations in New York and L.A., and it just sort of took off from there.
Okay.
We were legitimized because they were writing about us and playing us and sending us radio playlists. And then when Christgau gave us, I think it was an A- in the Village Voice, and I started getting contacted. Well, everything was out of my mom's basement, so I'd get these letters, at my post office box, and from Holland and distributors, and that's how it all started.
So the From Akron record is a full album that has one side is the Bizarros and the other side is the Rubber City Rebels. Is that correct?
Exactly, because we used our strongest songs. What we thought were the strongest Bizarro songs, what the Rebels thought theirs were the strongest.
Sure. We
didn't want to put each do an album with some weak materials.
Okay. That's interesting. That album is pretty collectible now, I believe. That original record, from what I understand.
Yeah, on eBay, anywhere from $3 to $200. So
shop wisely, folks, man. So that album comes out, and so things are starting to roll now. And I'm assuming at this time that the Bizarros are playing live shows fairly often, or am I wrong?
Yep. And we're blessed with the Rubber City Rebels actually owning the first club that had a lot of the independent bands. It's called the Crypt. It's where the Mercedes-Benz dealership near on East Market Street is now.
I didn't realize they owned that. I never realized that.
Well, it's a great story. There's a story that we'll talk about a little later, but there was a heck of a rubber worker strike around that time in Akron, and there was a bar, the Crypt, on East Market Street that was owned and operated by a rubber union guy, a rubber worker, and things were tough. And the Rubber City Rebels knocked on the door and said, "Hey man, we have this band, we'd love to play there." and he hung around there for a little bit, and one thing led to another, and the owner basically said, "Well, hey, you guys could not only play here, you could have it." It was a handshake deal. I don't know if there was any money exchange, but
Wow.
they were in the club business.
I think some of this, now that I think of it, was chronicled in that documentary that Phil Hoffman made. It's Everything and Then It's Gone.
Absolutely, that's perfect.
Yeah, and that film was done under the auspices of WKSU at the time. I guess Ideas Stream now.
I think it was Akron U.
Or was it Akron U?
Yeah,
Well, Akron U filmed it, yes,
Yeah,
but
'cause
then
he taught there.
then it showed on the Kent station on
Yeah.
4549, right? And then there was a second one called If You're Not Dead, Play, and that was sort of like the second generation of bands from that era. But we'll get into that topic at another time. But okay, so
That club was instrumental. The Dead Boys played there. Perubu had the Bizarros play at the Pirates Cove on Thursdays. We probably did 10 or 15.
That's in Cleveland.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in turn we brought them down to the Crypt.
okay, yeah. Yeah, that was sort of a common thing that there was a little more interaction between Cleveland and Akron bands at the time. I remember Unit 5, we would go to Cleveland and open for them, and then they'd come down to Akron and open for us. So, yeah, that was sort of a kind of a mutual back-scratching thing we did. But so you're playing at the Crypt. Are there other clubs you remember? Or, I'm just curious how often you guys were gigging. That's really my real
we
question.
had trouble finding drummers, and when we
They can be a problem.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Look at, when we were lucky enough to have a drummer, we'd play at the Crypt. We'd play. When we finally landed Rick Garberson as a drummer who was with us till he had that accidental carbon monoxide poisoning, where he passed away. We were gigging JB's in Kent. We had a Monday night gig for a while at a place used to be called Ramones, but it was called the Night Club at the time. We played Cincinnati Punk Rock Festival, us and a couple other bands. We played Columbus. We did New York. And
So, okay. So,
but locally, it was basically the Crypt, JB's, and the nightclub.
Right. Okay.
A couple of teen clubs. We played the annual union picnic for the post office.
You must have been a big hit, I'm sure. They loved you.
They just looked at us
incredulously.
Yeah.
All right, so you're gigging a lot, and now you got Clone is starting to take off. What are some of the? It's unfair for me to ask you these releases in order, I suppose.
I got them right here.
Oh, in that case, it's not unfair. So, what was the third and fourth releases? These would be real early original Clone items.
The Tin Huey EP.
Okay.
And then another Tin Huey. Well, actually, there were 12 45s and EPs.
Okay.
And starting with Bizarros and Tin Huey, I did a Harvey Gold solo, The Waitresses and the Human Switchboard, Teacher's Pet, which I also did a run on red vinyl. I got to tell you about it. In those days, it was less than 30 cents if you had like 1,000 of something made.
Right.
The 45s and later on, the LPs with the artwork and the covers were like a little over $1.
Yeah.
So you could afford to do.
Yeah, now it's like if you're in a band and you want to put your new record out on vinyl, which all the kids want to do that. It's really expensive. It can be prohibitively expensive. And back in our day, you were it was really a much more approachable adventure.
In Teacher's Pet, Ron Mullins requested that we do a run on red vinyl.
Okay.
And that was just like 10 cents more.
You were like, okay, I guess.
Another $100.
Right. Now, were these various Clone Records always recorded at the same studio, or they recorded at different things?
Oh, I was just thinking about that the other day. I'd say out of all these records, like 15 of them were done at Bushflow Studio.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And, let's say 13 of them. 2 were done actually at Suma in Painesville, the Unit 5 and the Gray Bunnies.
Okay, yeah.
And then, for the heck of it, I always heard about Man Ray Studios, which were what Devo used.
Mm-hmm.
And I did a record for a young kid who went on, John Rader went on to work for Arista Records.
Okay.
The nicest kid in the world at the time. He was just out of high school. And we used Man Ray. It was near the old Rolling Acres Mall in an old car wash.
Wow, okay.
They had a 4-track, Ampex 4-track, like what the Beatles used in the early days.
Mm-hmm.
And so I recorded it. Actually, his backing band was the Bizarros.
Oh, okay.
And Payne's, Suma twice, Man Ray once, and the rest at Bushflow. Although, when I did Bowling Balls 2,
mm-hmm.
it had a lot of different artists on it. It even had a band from Japan called Totsuzan Dan Ball, which translated means sudden cardboard. I just loved it. Was an extended version. They said, I got a lot of unsolicited music from all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
And they sent it to me on a reel-to-reel. Of course, I didn't have one, so I went to Tin Huey's, and I loved it, but I asked their permission if I could shorten it because it was like a 12-minute song.
Right.
So
let's back up now. Because there's a Bowling Balls 1.
Yeah, Bowling Balls 1 was
which was actually, it's called Bowling Balls from Hell, right?
Yeah, Bowling Balls from Hell. Uh-huh. And I, as far as I remember, I think almost all of it was done at Bushflow.
Okay. And that had Tin Huey on it. And these are like sampler albums of Akron bands.
Yeah. You had the first version of I Know What Boys Like, which is called, Wait Here, I'll Be Back.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
And, here's what somebody doesn't know. A song by Hurricane Bob, who was actually Bob Lewis, who was an original member of Devo,
mm-hmm.
who went on to become their manager.
Right.
And Dennis DeFrange, a local guy that was one of the electronic pioneers.
Uh-huh.
He moved to L.A., and I don't know what he's doing now, but a lot of his songs are on that.
Okay, right.
I guess got to be proud that in the last couple of years, a couple different British reissue albums have been reissuing some of my stuff. Like
mm-hmm.
The Bizarros are on 3 different releases from Soul Jazz Records, and they did one just on Akron called Burn Rubber City Burn that has Bizarros, Devo, Tin Huey, Waitresses, and the Numbers Band.
Yeah.
And then any day now, Ace Records from London is releasing an anthology of early 80s, 80 to 82, and besides bands like the Pretenders, Devo, The Cure, B-52s, we're honored to have a Bizarro song on it.
Yeah, that's cool.
But anyway, back to Bowling Balls 2. The Unit 5, I don't know where that was recorded. That was probably one of your original ones that we used.
That's at Bushflow.
Yeah, and
mm-hmm.
Tansuzen Den Ball was a Japanese issue. Chai Pig was done somewhere else, and Hammer Damage was done in a studio in Cleveland.
Mm-hmm. So there's Bowling Balls 1, and then a couple years later is the Bowling Balls 2 sampler album, which, again, the band that I played drums for, Unit 5, is featured on that album, and with 3 songs, as I remember. And I remember this album being, the Bowling Balls 2 being, I still think it's a really nice collection of music from that time, because, and from this area, because it's very representative of so many of the bands that were playing out all the time, and had a just the real Akron scene of that time.
And one Japanese band.
And one Japanese band, which everyone always was like, why are they here on this? And I was always like, well, ask Nick. He can explain it to you.
I loved the way they looked, and I liked their sound. They actually had a recording contract in Japan on an offshoot of A&M.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is From Akron and Beyond. I'm Bob Ethington, and we're here with my co-host Nick Nicholas talking about the origins and history of Clone Records, the independent record label that Nick founded that featured a lot of Akron artists and bands that went on in various ways to definitely make an imprint on the music world, locally for sure, and in some cases nationally. What's come up here several times is this Bush Flow Studios, and how a lot of the bands recorded there, and all the early Unit 5 recordings were done at Bush Flow. This is a place that was just on Oakdale Avenue, right here in Akron, West Akron. And it was really in the house of a guy named Mark Price. Mark Price was the bass player in the band Tin Huey and a founding member of Tin Huey, one of the originals, with Harvey Gold and Stuart Austin and Michael Elward. And they did a lot of their recordings there as well. It was basically built to, for their own purposes, but then they started hiring it out to other local bands. And it's a real trip back in time for me to remember recording there, because it was just such a funny place. I mean, you'd go in, and Mark, who he passed away some years ago. He had cancer. It was very sad because he was such a vibrant, interesting guy, really, really a unique individual. And he was into a lot of kind of like arcane spirituality stuff. So you'd go in, and over all of his recording stuff in the speakers were these huge pyramids. Remember, they were all encased in pyramids, which was supposed to somehow enhance the power, And so we would go to record down in his basement. And so he'd be upstairs. He couldn't see. There was no visual element to this. He's upstairs. We can hear him over headphones. We're downstairs in these baffled rooms, to keep the drums from bleeding into the guitars and vice versa. And it was always really fun to record, but it always seemed like as the night went on, when we'd go up for playbacks, the sound kept getting louder and louder. But I remember, like, by the end of some evenings, I'm like, I can't mix any of this anymore because I've completely lost my bearings.
I remember when Dave Robinson, who owned Stiff Records, was in town, actually overseeing the final stages of the Stiff Akron sampler, and he was asking Mark Price about, what are these pyramid speakers, blah blah blah. And Mark went into this long thing about why, it didn't make any sense, but he believed it.
Yeah. If it worked for him, it worked for us, I guess. Yeah, it was a funny place, and I'm sure that house is still there on Oakdale. I'm not
beautiful
sure who lives
old
there now,
brick house with a lot of the great oak woodwork throughout.
Probably like 19, turn of the century home. I'm guessing. Yeah. So, can you think of any other Clone releases you'd want to talk about specifically?
I'm proud of all of them, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I just first Bizarro's EP just because it was the first, and it turned into a lot more than I'd ever hoped for.
Mm-hmm.
And the From Akron album, the Waitresses, and the Human Switchboard, and the Bowling Balls too. I'm very proud of, because that got some of the best reviews of anything I did.
Mm-hmm.
And the only LP I did actually of a band on their own was the Unit 5, and that's really proud of that, the way that came out.
And that's a totally different story, because the Unit 5 album, Scared to the Dark, was recorded at, as Nick has mentioned previously, at Suma Recording Studios, which was owned by Paul Hammond.
Oh, no, that was a son.
Oh, that was his son?
Paul was the son of the
But it was
Kenny.
But it was Ken Hammond, though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. So
Kenny Hammond was the founder. He worked for Cleveland Recording, and he was famous. He had a lot of important songs he worked on. I think there was a gold record there, Play That Funky Music.
Yeah, the Wild Cherry song.
That he engineered.
Uh-huh. And Michael Stanley recorded there. And I think they did a lot of and Para Ubu, yes. And they also did a lot of commercial recordings just for for ads and things. I mean, it was a very big studio. I mean, you could have a full orchestra in there.
An old mansion in Painesville that they turned into a recording studio.
Right, right. So that was a totally new experience for, I think, all of us. Yeah, because it was, recording at a much more sophisticated level and more, I guess you might say, professional level.
Although, we did our Mercury record album there, and that's how I became familiar with it.
Oh, okay.
So that was, it's not like I picked them out of the blue.
Right.
We were real happy the way, because Piribu was recording there, and we went there because of them, and we're happy with it.
Yeah. So you had a relationship with them already. Okay.
Actually, our engineer wound up. I can't think of his name right now. He got a Grammy for.
Oh, really?
He wound up buying the classical record label that was in Cleveland, which I can't think of the name of it now. But he got a Grammy for some of the classical albums he did there.
Okay.
He was our engineer.
Interesting. Well, anyway, so recording that album was really fun. It was probably challenging to us because we were basically a live band that, gigged out all the time. And so we weren't really used to recording stuff in parts, I mean, we're just going to, we were play together, but the idea was, do we have a drum track down? Do we have a bass track down? Okay, that's good. Now we'll build on that with the guitars and the, keyboards and the vocals. And, it was really new territory for us to do it that way. When the album came out, I was, I'll be totally frank about it. I was a little disappointed with it because I felt like it didn't capture what we sounded like live. As the years have gone on, I've come to like it a lot. Because it's very 80s.
Yeah.
And I guess, and now when I hear it back, it's just, I'm like, yeah, that's what bands sounded like then and what their albums sounded like and their records sounded like. So yeah, I've really kind of changed my tune about that. And our album got some good reviews. I remember the Scene magazine had it gave it a very good review, and then had it for 2 or 3 months every week as one of their 3 or 4 picks of the best albums that were out currently or whatever. And of course, that was with Tracy Thomas was our singer, and kind of started from there. I guess we also, while we were talking about Unit 5, we should at Summa, we should mention this bizarre anomaly, the Gray Bunnies, which was as I recall, a Nick idea for us, which was basically make a sort of an anonymous 12-inch with just 2 songs on it. It would be kind of aimed at sort of for dance clubs, I guess, like Danceteria or whatever. And you had us do a song that Phil Spector had done with one of his girl groups, and I'm not sure if it was who it was now offhand. I don't remember, but it was he hit me and it felt like a kiss, which we thought was kind of edgy at the time. Of course, it was edgy at the time. Now I look back at it and I'm like, oh boy, what were we thinking? So I don't talk about that song very often. And then we just kind of wrote in the studio a song called Cigarette that was just basically an instrumental for the B-side. But yeah, it's really funny because people will come to me from time to time and they'll be like, yeah, I'm collecting all the Clone records and I can't find this Gray Bunnies 12-inch. And then they'll be like, well, who were they? I've never even heard of them. And I'm always like, well, I actually know the whole story on that particular one.
It's really weird. I was with Jim Jarmusch a couple years ago.
The film director.
Yeah. And, he's from Akron. And talking about Clone Records, Bizarros and stuff, and out of the blue he goes, who are the Gray Bunnies? I mean, this guy, world famous, wants to know about the Gray. And I had to tell him what you just said.
Yeah.
Oh, I just made it up, just. And you know what, though? I don't want to forget, I just remembered another studio that I used. I used Universal Studios in Chicago to do 45 by a band called the Housekeepers. And lo and behold, the Housekeepers were led by Jimmy Donahue, Phil Donahue's son. And
the famous talk show host.
Yeah.
Years back, yeah.
What a nice young man. It was a pleasure working with him. But what was interesting about it was he didn't want anybody to know he was Phil Donahue's son.
Right.
Which he wanted to do it on his own. So I never mentioned it.
Yeah.
And it was never talked about or written about.
Right.
And it was just really cool. And I remember using Universal Studios in Chicago, which it was right after the Blues Brothers recorded there.
Oh, okay.
So I got a chance to talk to the engineers there about, how nice Belushi and Aykroyd were. They're like really nice guys to work with.
That's cool. Well, the Phil, this is real arcane information, but the Phil, as I recall, the Phil Donahue show was based in Chicago.
Yeah, and they lived there. Him and Marlo Thomas lived there.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, there's an interesting story that when the record was finished, a friend of mine was Phil Donahue, Marlo Thomas's manager, Eddie Elias. He also managed Chi-Chi Rodriguez. He was a really, talk about cheerleaders for Akron. That guy did so much for the city. Marlo Thomas gave David Geffen a copy of the Housekeepers record. Okay. And he basically said how crappy it was. And, the Eagles and the Housekeepers. But anyway, so I had to go to Chicago and redo it. It didn't sound much different because anyway, that's just interesting.
Oh, that's funny. So this is From Akron and Beyond. I'm Bob Ethington. We've been talking with Nick Nicholas, who is the co-host of this show, but also was the founder of Clone Records and also the leader of the Akron band, the Bizarros. And we've been basically talking about the history of Clone Records and its influence. Now, as we kind of move towards the end of this particular show, I'm curious about like the Clone Records like inventory and like, do you get people ever reaching out to you, like wondering about, I do. I mean, just at my little level, people ask me about getting a Unit 5 album or getting, maybe one of the Devo singles or whatever. And, which I imagine those are pretty sparse at this point, or scarce, I should say. But, what's sort of the status of that work? And I guess I should ask, leading into that question, how eventually, obviously, Clone kind of came to an end, right? I mean, and I know that's probably a less happy subject, but how did that kind of happen?
Well, it was my second child was born, and I was, running Clone, playing in the Bizarros, working as a LD tutor and a home instruction tutor for Akron Public Schools, working for City of Akron Recreation Department in the evening, practicing, like 4.5 days a week.
So you were pretty busy.
Yeah, a second child means, a little bit more responsibility.
Sure.
You're not going to become David Geffen out of Akron. And so everything just, stopped. And I had thousands of records. And over the years, I still have almost the early stuff's almost all gone, but I have a lot of the latest, the later stuff that I did a lot of quantity, the Unit 5 and the Gray Buddies.
Yeah.
And Housekeepers. Mm-hmm. I broke even on everything. When I'd make some money selling this and that, I put it into the next one. So it was more, fun than it was ever a business venture.
Sort of a labor of love for you. Yeah.
I'm still proud of what came out of this. There were a lot of labels around the country SST from California. You hear what are some. There's a few of them out there, but Clones is 16 releases is quite a bit just from that standpoint.
Right. And I just think, again, I think a point that should be underlined is in the late 80s and then into the 90s, there were a lot of indie labels, and a lot of the best music was coming out on those indie labels. But when you did this, there weren't that many. I mean, it was a much more unique enterprise that you undertook at that time. So, yeah, you should be proud of that. I think it's very cool. It's a nice part of your legacy.
Thank you.
So that has been Nick Nicholas, and I am Bob Ethington. This has been From Akron and Beyond. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will be back next time with a new topic. See you then.